Hey there, I'm Robin Goebel. I'm really delighted and honored to be with you for this event. We're going to be looking at the impact of toxic stress, trauma, and loss on the developing brain. I'm recording this for you from my studio home office outside Grand Rapids, Michigan. My family and I relocated here last summer, in the summer of 2019. We came here after living in Austin, Texas for about 15 years. And in Austin, I had a private clinical psychotherapy practice where the bulk of my clients and my area of expertise was working with families of kids who had experienced toxic stress, trauma, and loss in their histories. Many of the families that I'd worked with were parenting kids who had been adopted from foster care or internationally. And a large portion of the families that I've had the great privilege and honor of working with over the last 15 years have been families caring for kinship children, grandchildren, stepchildren, nieces or nephews, families who have brought these kids into their home and cared for them lovingly and oftentimes without as much support as they really need. So it's really awesome that this event is being put together, and I'm just thrilled to be contributing my one little piece to it. We're kind of going to go back to the impact of toxic stress, trauma, and loss 101. There are three key things that I really want you to take away from this webinar. There's a lot of information that I'm going to toss at you over the next hour and a half, but really it's just these three things that I hope you walk away with. Behavior is simply an externalization of inner experience. So we're going to get really good at using the behavior as kind of like cues and clues for what's happening internally. And we're going to remember that the behavior is simply what we see, which means the most effective way to get behavior change is if we can target what's underneath, what the real problem is, because behavior is simply the externalization of inner experience. Okay, so that's the most important thing I'd love for you to walk away with today. Number two, connection is a biological imperative, and I'm going to give you a little bit of science to kind of help back that claim up. I know from spending my entire career being in the trenches with families who are caring for kids who have experienced toxic stress, trauma, loss, especially inside those family relationships, that these kids can feel as though the last thing they want is connection. And certainly they don't want connection to us. So one of the things that's been really helpful for me to just anchor into and remember, even when it seems like it's definitely not true, is this idea that connection is a biological imperative. And then the third most important thing I want you to walk away with today is kind of my primary talking point, my primary thing that I move through the world in believing, which is that regulated, connected kids who feel safe behave well. So I'm going to say that again. Regulated, connected kids who feel safe behave well. What this means for me is if I'm with a child who is not behaving quote unquote well, I want to get really, really, really curious about that. I want to think, because I know that behavior is an externalization of inner experience and that connection is a biological imperative, I'm going to ask myself these three questions. Is this child regulated? Is this child connected? And does this child feel safe? And if not, How do I target those things? Because regulated, connected kids who feel safe behave well. And by behave well, I mean behave in like pro-social, age appropriate, developmentally appropriate ways. I'm not talking about perfect children who never do things that they're not supposed to do. I'm talking about inside the, if we're holding the lens of like what's developmentally appropriate here. Regulated, connected kids who feel safe, behave well. So those are my 3 things. Again, we've got an hour and a half together. I'm going to give you a ton of information. Those are really the only 3 things I want you to walk away with. We're going to start with behavior is simply an externalization of inner experience. The brain is behind every single thing that we do. And when it comes to behavior, it can be easy to forget that, right? Like the brain is behind our heart rate, and the brain is behind breathing, and the brain is behind our ability to walk and talk and do all these things, right? Like the brain powers us. It's behind every single thing that we do. Sometimes when we're looking at behaviors, especially really difficult behaviors or behaviors that aren't ideal for families or school or in social situations, it's really easy to remember the brain as a really key piece of these behavioral challenges. And we start to overclassify behavioral difficulties as like character challenges or like these finite ways that children are, that this child is just a liar, this child is just a thief, those kinds of things. And I get that. It makes a lot of sense when we're with kids who really struggle and have pretty chronic behavioral challenges. It's really easy to get entrenched in that way of looking at their behaviors. In this webinar, and to help you be the most successful that you can be at parenting these kids, it's really going to serve you to remember that behavior is simply an externalization of inner experience. In our time together today, I'm going to be encouraging you to practice putting on and keeping on your X-ray vision goggles so that when you're faced with a behavior challenge, you can do this thing about looking just like straight through the behaviors and into the child's brain and mind and body, specifically connection and regulation and felt safety. Those things are impacted by their early histories and by toxic stress and trauma and loss. And if we want to be effective at shifting some of those really difficult behaviors, we've got to stop focusing only on the behaviors. Use those X-ray vision goggles, look past the behaviors and into their brain and their mind. And again, remembering that the brain is behind literally every single thing that we do. So let's take some time to look at the brain and understand the brain and how the brain contributes and relates to behaviors and the behaviors that we see. And then we'll move into looking at how toxic stress and trauma and loss has impacted the brain and how that impacts the behaviors that we're dealing with. So this is an oversimplification, but it's enough for our purposes that we can look at the brain in these 3 major parts: the brain stem, the limbic brain, and the cortex. The brain stem is the bottommost and the innermost part of the brain. And then the limbic part of the brain starts to develop outside the brainstem and kind of around the brainstem, but still inside the brain. Like if we opened up my skull and looked at the brain, we wouldn't see limbic parts of the brain and we wouldn't see the brainstem. What we would see if we opened up my skull and looked into my brain is the cortex. That's the outside most part of the brain. So the brain develops actually from the bottom up and the inside out. So again, that brain stem, lowest part of the brain, most inside the brain. It sits right on top of the spinal cord inside the brain. Then the limbic parts of the brain develop on top of the brainstem and outside the brainstem, and we start to get a little further towards the outside of the brain. So the brainstem, there's just one brainstem area of the brain. As we move into the limbic parts of the brain is when we start to have the bilateral hemispheres. So you've probably heard about like the right and the left hemisphere, or the right and the left brain. We don't have a right and a left brainstem, but we do have a right and left limbic area. As the brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out, it starts to lateralize into this limbic portion of the brain. And then again, the cortex totally on the outside, right and left hemisphere cortex. So the brainstem is largely developed in utero. For the most part, healthy full-term infants burst into the world with a pretty fully functioning brainstem. So the brainstem is responsible for all of our autonomic functions: heart rate, respiration, blood sugar, temperature modulation, energy and arousal, all the things that happen we never think about these kind of things, right? We're not thinking about our heart beating, or not thinking about breathing, all those autonomic functions that babies do when they come this side of the womb, right? So their brainstem does continue to develop outside the womb. And you can think about how like newborn babies need some support with temperature modulation, right? That when babies are first born, we're still really swaddling and keeping them really cozy and bundled up, because they need some support with that autonomic function of temperature modulation. But within the first few months, we can really start to decrease how much we provide that external support as the baby's brain takes over. If you know anything about preemie babies, what you know is that they are born before their brainstem is fully developed. And so we have to support preemies, right, in the NICU, sometimes with breathing, with sucking, with waist, with temperature modulation, kidney functioning, blood sugar, all those autonomic functions. We keep babies in the NICU and we support them. Basically, we help those systems along while they have time to continue to fully develop. When babies are born, they don't really have a fully functioning limbic parts of the brain. I mean, the babies are born with a full brain, but it's through experiences in the world, and particularly through experiences with the caregiver in the earliest years, that the brain develops connections and all of the richness that allows the brain to work as effectively as we hope that it will. So that limbic part of the brain comes on next. And the limbic portion of the brain is emotions and attachment, connections. And then the limbic part of the brain is doing this really, really, really important thing that will be important to remember for later on in this training. That limbic part of the brain is kind of the watchtower part of the brain. It's scanning for danger. The limbic part of the brain is really concerned with keeping us safe and alive. And so 4 times every second, not every 4 seconds, but 4 times every second. So every quarter of a second at least, the limbic part of the brain is scanning the environment, scanning our internal experience, and asking, am I safe or not safe? Now, this is true about all humans. We're not yet talking about the impact of toxic stress on the brain. This is just average, normal, typical brain development. 4 times every second, our brains are asking safe or not safe. And if the brain lands on not safe, or maybe not safe, or very not safe, The limbic part of the brain sends a message down to the brainstem where those autonomic functions are and energy and arousal. Okay, so the limbic part of the brain says, whoops, not safe, sends a message to the brainstem, and it's the brainstem then that gives our body the energy and arousal that we need for survival. So for fight, flight, freeze, or collapse kind of energy. Okay, so then the next part of the brain to develop and start to come online is the cortex. Language, reasoning. When I'm working with kids and families in my office, I refer to the cortex as like our thinking brain. And I talk about how that's the brain that we're used to do math and to remember facts and to remember our friends' names and, you know, to have good social skills and to know how to play with our friends. That's our cortex thinking brain, okay? All right, so let's look at how the limbic and the cortex part of the brain develop, because this is going to become important. So I told you that the brainstem is developed primarily in utero. And so the limbic brain then is starting to develop once that baby is out in the world, through the co-regulation of the adult, of the caregiver. So that, remember that limbic part of the brain is attachment and connection, right? And so this baby comes into the world and has a fully functioning brainstem, lots of energy and arousal. But what the infant doesn't have yet is the regulatory system, the brake system, right? So babies have lots of ability to have energy and arousal, and they can cry, 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 cry. But babies don't soothe, do they? If you've ever taken care of a newborn baby, babies don't soothe on their own. And it's through the co-regulated relationship, meaning it's through the experience of the adult coming to the baby who's upset and soothing, shh, baby, oh, it's okay, it's okay. I, as the regulated, calm adult, pick up their baby when they cry and soothe them. And it is through that experience, and think about babies, right? This is happening over and 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 over again. And it's through that co-regulated experience of the baby crying and the adult coming in that we are building this limbic portions of the brain. It's through the soothing and the joining of the regulated adults that the baby's energy and arousal soothes and regulates. This begins the patterning in of what we will ultimately call regulation or self-regulation. So that's the big focus of the brain and the nervous system for about like the first 18-ish months of age. And then somewhere between 18 and 36 months, the calm, regulated, safe limbic system that's been co-regulated by the regulated adult. Next, the cortical parts of the brain begin to come online, and we see language skills and we see improved cognitive skills. And again, if you've ever cared for a toddler, you see their bursts in language, you see their curiosity, you see their whys, right? That's their cortical brain beginning to come online. Okay, so the next piece that we're going to hit is that connection is a biological imperative. Steve Porges, medical doctor, actually came into my field, into the trauma field, into the psychotherapy field, into the relational neurosciences field, came to us from the medical field. He was doing research on neonates and heart rate variability. And his early research and what he began to understand about the autonomic nervous system people in my field started to pay attention. People in the trauma field were like, whoa, what this guy is saying is really important. And since then, it's been about 20 plus years, Dr. Porges has developed a really fantastic relationship with the trauma and the psychotherapy field and the mental health field, which is fantastic because the more we understand brain science, the more we legitimize our approach to helping brains heal. So Dr. Porges, in all of his research, then also offered us this idea that connection is a biological imperative. So out of the research that he's done on the autonomic nervous system, his belief at this point is that connection is our default. Like, we are born to be in connection. Our brains assume connection. They're always seeking connection. It's a biological imperative. We don't lose the ability and the desire and the preference for connecting. Dr. Porges's research makes it really clear that this seeking system to seek relationships, our seeking system seeks all sorts of things, but one of the things it's seeking is relationships. The seeking system is innate, meaning it's always there. It's always there, and we're born with it. We're always trying to find each other and wanting to move toward each other. And this is true at all ages and stages. We always need each other to regulate. We're always looking for connection. And we're doing this especially in times of intense emotions. Now, again, I know that those of you listening to this webinar are parenting kids at times, or maybe a lot of times, or maybe even some of you feel like always, these kids don't have much that demonstrates that they also are looking for and seeking connection. I get that. I have those kids in my office also. I have spent 15 years supporting and being in the trenches with those kids and those families. And it has made such a difference to me to remember that even if I'm with a kid who's not demonstrating anything that suggests they're seeking connection or that connection is a biological imperative, it doesn't mean that it's not there. What it means is that connection, for whatever reason, is feeling so unsafe, so dangerous, so vulnerable, that that part of them is being kind of covered up and superseded by another part of them, which is protecting themselves from connection. These both parts exist, right? That even if you're parenting a child who has a really big part of them that seems as though I don't want connection at all, right? We can be continually reminding ourselves that even if I don't see it, there is always a part of this child who is still seeking connection. And sometimes I just needed to hold on to that theory, like to hold on to that belief that it mattered, that it was important that I kept still moving towards this child with connection, and that I remembered and believed that the child did want connection. Oftentimes, holding on to that belief was mostly for my benefit or for the parents that I worked with for their benefit. It really helped them kind of keep on keeping on, even when things were super, super, super hard. This holding on to this core belief that even if I can't see it, I know that connection is a biological imperative, and there's some part of this child who is seeking connection. Okay, and then the third thing that I talked about at the very beginning, that first slide where I said, I want you to remember these three things, is this idea that regulated, connected kids who feel safe and know what to do behave well. Now, I threw that "and know what to do" part in there because it's true that sometimes kids who have been in a really tough environments or have missed out on a lot of kind of the normal experiences of life, they actually really don't know what to do. And there is an aspect of having to teach kids things that we're shocked they don't know how to do. You know, eat with utensils, clean up after themselves, acknowledge somebody when they say hello to you. Like literally, sometimes these kids need to be taught those things. I will say that's not typically the reason kids are misbehaving. In general, kids do know what the right thing to do is. It's about not being regulated, not being connected, or not feeling safe. One of those things, two of those things, or all three of those things. Because regulated, connected kids who feel safe and know what to do behave well. And so we can take our X-ray vision goggles and look past the behavior and ask ourselves, if behavior is an externalization of inner experience, what's going on with this kid? Is there impaired regulation? Is there impaired connection? Or is there impaired felt safety? So let's define regulation. Regulation is a really key concept in understanding why people are behaving the way that they are, why we're behaving the way that they are, and then gives us some ideas about what do we do to help this person be more successful. So Dr. Dan Siegel, you've maybe already heard of him. He writes some really popular, excellent parenting books. This one's taken from Parenting from the Inside Out, but you also may be familiar with his books, The Whole Brain Child, No Drama Discipline, Brainstorm. I think his most recent book is called The Power of Showing Up. So he has some great parenting books. I definitely encourage you to check them out. He has some really good videos too that you can find through Googling or on YouTube, parenting related and brain and relational neuroscience related. But in Parenting from the Inside Out, Dr. Siegel defined regulation as keeping the accelerator and the brakes in balance. And as we're talking about emotional regulation, we're going to be talking about arousal. So regulation is a word that applies to all sorts of things, right? Like the regulation of our blood pressure, the regulation of our heart rate, the regulation of the temperature in our houses, right? Like we maintain temperature regulation in our homes through the thermostats and all this kind of good stuff. We're going to be thinking about regulation through the idea of arousal. So keeping the accelerator and the brakes of arousal in balance. We talked about the brainstem at the beginning of our time together and how the brainstem holds the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is the part of the brain that's responsible for all those autonomic functions, right? Including energy and arousal. So we're going to break down the autonomic nervous system just a teeny tiny bit further to help us understand this concept of regulation. So there's two branches then of the autonomic nervous system: the accelerator, the go, 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 the energy branch, and the brake branch. Okay, so the accelerator, the energy, the gas of the autonomic nervous system is called the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And then the brake section of the autonomic nervous system is called the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So we have the sympathetic branch, the accelerator, the gas of the car, right? And there's energy there. And so stress, which doesn't have to be bad, right? Stress helps us get things done, right? It's an accelerator. Surprise or an excitement, again, increased energy is the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And if our brains are, I'm going to use the word neuroreceiving danger. Remember in the one of the first slides, when we talked about the brain and brain development, we talked about how the brain is scanning for danger at least 4 times every second. We're going to call that neuroreceiving. Okay, neuroreceiving safety or danger, way below conscious awareness, of course, since it's 4 times every second. We're not doing that consciously, right? So if the brain is neuroreceiving danger, meaning it's landed on not safe, the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is responsible for our fight, flight, freeze behavior. So run, 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 run away, or fight, 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 or freeze, Okay, and you think about how all of those responses, fight, flight, and freeze, there's a lot of energy in the limbs. All right, there's energy in the arms, there's energy in the legs. And this is the protective system that's helping keep us safe, run away or fight. Okay. Okay, so that's the accelerator branch, the accelerator side of the autonomic nervous system. Then there has to be a brake, right? What goes up must come down, especially because we're talking about regulation and regulating the system. So energy breaks, energy breaks. The brakes are exactly that. They're bringing the energy down. The brakes allow us to be socially engaged and connected with each other. In fact, one way we can call the system is the social engagement system. The brakes help us calm, relax, repair, and restore our inner experience, right? That we can't be in constant go, go, go sympathetic arousal. Like, we've got to have this opportunity for kind of like rest and restore and repair. It's similar to thinking about if I wanted to run a marathon. I can't just wake up one morning after not having trained, not being a runner, not really having an exercise program, and deciding that I'm going to go out and start running 10 miles every day, right? There's not enough time to repair and restore that level of intensity. So I need to start with a smaller amount. And two, I need to have time in between those bursts of energy to allow my system to rest and repair. And the same is true for all of our autonomic experiences. If the part of my brain that's saying safe or not safe decides not only am I in danger, not only am I not safe, I am actually in life-threatening danger, then the parasympathetic brake throws what we're going to call the emergency brake. So, the accelerator brake works, somewhat similarly to an automobile, and we can just brake gently as we roll up to a stop sign or pull into our driveway. But our cars also have this emergency brake that can get thrown really fast. And that's this part of the brake that gets thrown if the neuroception, if that 4 times every second decides that we're not just in danger, we're in life-threatening danger. And then that parasympathetic emergency brake throws us into a state of collapse. So fight or flight had me with a lot of energy in my arms and my legs, but collapse has all the energy leaving my limbs, coming into my viscera, protecting my abdomen, protecting my head. And there is a release of energy. The energy all moves in. Our heart rate slows, our respiration slows. All of those are attempts at saving our lives, okay? All right, so if we put this in like a little picture graph, we would see accelerator, brake, accelerator, brake, accelerator, brake, up and down and up and down. And it's this nice, gentle, regulated, balanced sine wave. Attachment is the foundation for regulation, which I've already given you a little bit of sneak peek for, right? When we talked about how that limbic part of the brain is developed through the co-regulation of the adult through the attachment system. Okay, so the attachment system is about need expressed, need met, then relax. Need expressed in the infant, the need is met by the caregiver, the infant can relax. Well, remember on that slide a few slides ago where we saw that caregiver soothing the baby, right? That the baby has this energy, sympathetic arousal, but babies don't have that parasympathetic break. So as the babies get excited and become upset, and there's a lot of energy in their nervous system, they need that caregiver to come in and soothe and meet their need and help their systems move into that relaxed trust place of their system. So you can see here on this slide that on the one side of the cycle, we've got need, express, sympathetic arousal, accelerator, gas, right? And then the need is met. That's the parasympathetic break, soothe and calm. And it is through that attachment experience repeatedly happening over and over and over and over and over again, 1,000,000 bajillion times in that first 12 months of life, that we set not only the foundation for attachment, but we set the foundation for regulation. And so we have this accelerator and we have this brake, and they move up and they move down. And in a regulated brain, developmentally appropriate regulated brain, because what that means for a 12-month-old versus a 5-year-old versus an 8-year-old versus an 18-year-old is not the same, of course, but developmentally appropriate. The regulated nervous system has an accelerator and a brake that comes up and down and stays inside this energetic window of tolerance. Okay, so the window of tolerance is this space inside our nervous system in which we can tolerate stress without kind of like freaking out or losing it or behaving in socially inappropriate ways, behaving in protective ways where we become more concerned with ourselves and keeping ourselves safe than we do maybe about the relationship or people around us. But when we're inside our window of tolerance, we are managing the stress, we're managing the up, and we're managing the down without freaking out. So let's look then at how trauma, toxic stress, and loss impacts the development of the brain, and then ultimately what that could mean for behaviors. Peter Levine is an expert in the trauma field, the psychotherapy mental health field, and has developed a somatic, a body-based way of healing trauma. Says that trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathic witness. Trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathic witness. Trauma is about being all alone. Trauma is about not being co-regulated. Trauma is about intensity of feelings, intensity of arousal without being co-regulated by someone else. Traumatic experiences, kind of by definition, push us outside that window of tolerance and require co-regulation in order for us to be okay. How wide our window of tolerance and, you know, the kinds of experiences that push us outside our window of tolerance vary based on a whole lot of things. But let's think for a moment about like the developing brain in the first 12 months of life. Those experiences, and they don't even have to be overtly traumatic, but just kind of normal baby experiences of being hungry or tired or needing something. And they have that sympathetic arousal, they have that energy burst, but maybe nobody comes to soothe them, right? Maybe the co-regulation isn't available. And so instead of their brain soothing and their limbic parts of their brain developing in the way that we would hope and expect, those limbic parts of the brain, the fear centers of the brain, those sympathetically aroused energy, something's not right parts of the brain, they stay on. Okay, so remember there's this sympathetic accelerator for babies. They need somebody to lend them. They kind of borrow from the caregiver's brake, and that helps create this regulated system of energy and arousal. in toxic stress or trauma and loss, the infant who remains unco-regulated, nobody's coming to care for them, their fear centers remain on. And you can see in this graphic, if you compared it to the graphic that I first showed you at the beginning of the webinar, the brain stem and the limbic parts of the brain, the danger parts of the brain, the yellow and the blue parts of the brain are much larger. And then that thinking part of the brain, the part of the brain that helps us make good choices, you know, cause and effect, ask ourselves, like, is this really a problem that I need to react to? Like, those are all thinking brain behaviors, right? That part of the brain is smaller, while these lower parts, the danger kind of fear centers of the brain remain on because they haven't been co-regulated. The circle of security talks about parent behaviors that they would call mean, weak, or gone that can contribute to this traumatic experience, this toxic stress experience, these outside the window of tolerance experiences that don't get co-regulated. So mean, what the circle of security means by that is what we would think about with overt abuse, right? The infant is being hurt, or they're witnessing their caregivers hurting someone else. Okay, that's the infant's experience with a caregiver who's mean. A caregiver that the circle of security would call weak is a caregiver that's unable to provide the level of safety that the infant needs. And so maybe that caregiver is being hurt themselves. And so they can't care for the infant. Or maybe that caregiver has such a significant trauma history themselves that they actually feel afraid of their dysregulated infant, the crying baby, the baby that has a need. Sometimes these parents are afraid of the baby and they label the baby in these ways that aren't actually accurate. Babies aren't trying to hurt parents, but sometimes for some parents, their own trauma history is so present that they actually feel afraid of the baby. And then of course, they're not providing the co-regulation that the baby needs. And then the third thing is that the circle of security talks about is gone. So parents who maybe are like literally gone, they're absent, they go to work for 8 hours a day while their baby is home all alone. Or maybe they're physically present, but kind of like emotionally or energetically absent because they're abusing substances and their brains are really taken over and impacted by the impact of the substance. Or this could be a parent who, again, has such a significant mental health history that they experience, you know, large times of being dissociated or being physically present, but just emotionally, energetically absent. So when the caregiver is mean, weak, or gone, the baby still has needs and expresses those needs, but their needs remain unmet, which means that they remain in a state of heightened arousal, right? That the caregiver doesn't come in and soothe their arousal. Instead, unfortunately, they stay in that sympathetically aroused, energetic gas kind of part of the nervous system, the accelerator part, and the caregiver doesn't come in and lend them their brakes ultimately, which would be building in the system of regulation so the baby remains in a continued state of arousal. So again, when those infants aren't soothed and their caregivers are experienced by them as mean, weak, or gone, and these can be like very well-intentioned, well-meaning caregivers who simply because of their own traumatic past or their own significant difficulties in life or their own significant difficulties regulating their own emotions, they're experienced by the baby as mean, weak, or gone. And so again, the brain, those parts of the brain that are developing versus the first 12 months of life, remember that limbic part of the brain develops around the experience of kind of chronic overactivation, chronic danger. So instead of feeling safe and soothed, this child's brain experiences the world as chronically dangerous, and they're always on high alert. So if we looked at that kind of window of tolerance graphic again, we could see their nervous systems as looking more like this graphic instead of that nice up and down regulated sine wave of accelerator, brake, accelerator, brake. Instead, we see this like accelerator, pedal to the metal, stuck on, and then the brakes, and it's like 0 to 60, 0 to 60, and we're stuck on, or we're stuck off, right? And almost always when I show this graphic to parents of kids who've experienced complex trauma or toxic stress, loss, and their histories, their parents look at this graphic and they're like, yes, this describes my kid. Unpredictable. I never know what's coming or how to help, right? This is the nervous system of a child impacted by toxic stress, trauma, and loss. And what this does is leads to an overactive feeling brain, right? And significantly impaired regulation. So it's this idea of kind of the mountain and the molehill thing, right? Like this brain, this overactive danger brain, due to the lack of co-regulation, experiences minor stress as major fight, flight, freeze, or collapse catastrophes. So the tiniest little stress blows this child's brain and body and nervous system completely outside their window of tolerance, which contributes to their caregivers feeling baffled and confused and overwhelmed, like, oh my gosh, what is even happening here, right? Because sometimes it's hard to even have any idea, like, what on earth has caused this meltdown or this extreme reaction. And it's because of the significantly impaired regulation, we can have this teeny tiny little stress that leaves the body and the brain, that overactive danger brain, the brain that's constantly scanning for safe or not safe, right? That brain and the overactive danger brain thinks everything is not safe and thinks everything is like a lot not safe. So the tiniest stressor get a reaction of my life is in danger. This doesn't have to necessarily look like huge dysregulation, like physical aggression, but it could look like verbal aggression. It could look like opposition. It can look like defiance, lying, stealing, manipulation. These are all behaviors of a nervous system that believes it is not safe. And for a lot of our kids that are being cared for in new families now, not necessarily the families where the toxic stress was experienced, but they're in new families now, their brains are still impacted by those earliest experiences of those early toxic stress. And so even though things are safe now, their brain is still reacting as though things are not safe. And they're having behaviors of opposition, defiance, verbal aggression, physical aggression, lying, stealing, food issues, manipulation, and control, right? Those are behaviors of a brain that doesn't feel safe. We're going to now spend the rest of our time together today talking about, okay, so what do we do about this? How do we help the brain of a child impacted by toxic stress, trauma, and loss? Now, to be fair, that's a topic that well exceeds our time together today. There's lots of books, lots of resources, lots of courses and conferences and workshops and webinars that all kind of address these different pieces of the equation. But I do want to give you kind of this overarching way that we can help the brain calm so that we can, fix this whole mountain out of a molehill, impaired regulation that is driving the behavioral challenges that you're experiencing in your home. So we're going to spend the rest of our time together talking about how to build resilience in the brain. How do we help widen that window of tolerance, widen that child's ability to tolerate stress, and really smooth out that sine wave? That's what we're going to be looking at when we think about the word resilience. The word resilience, if we look at it from the world of physics, from a harder science, the word resilience means the ability of an elastic material to absorb energy and release that energy as it springs back into its original shape. So resilience is about stress tolerance. So resilience is about, I can tolerate things not going my way. I can tolerate frustration. I can, all these things that can send your kid 0 to 60, kicking and screaming on the floor or cussing or whatever the behaviors are that you're experiencing in your home. Increasing resilience means that we could increase their ability to absorb the energy of the stress and release that energy, then shifting back into their original shape. Okay, so the definition we're going to work with about resilience in our time together today is the capacity to return to connection, regulation, and felt safety after experiencing distress, fear, or overwhelm with ease. Because returning to connection, regulation, and felt safety after experiencing distress and fear and overwhelm is not a race. We're not trying to do it super fast, but resilience and returning back to connection, regulation, and felt safety provides our nervous systems and our children's nervous systems the opportunity for rest and recovery. Remember, we talked about the importance of that parasympathetic break and rest and recovery and that experience in our nervous system of ease. And so the more resilience that we can help our kids' brains and bodies and nervous systems develop, I am not promising that that's going to take away all of their behavior problems. I'm not promising that that's going to take away all of their trauma triggers or all that kind of stuff. But the more resilience that we have, the quicker we're going to return to connection, regulation, and felt safety with ease. So there's more experiences of rest and recovery. And I think that sounds like a pretty good goal. Just like toxic stress changes the brain, relational healing changes the brain. Kids who experience early toxic stress, trauma, and loss inside relationship, the key to healing the brain, the key to building resilience is relational healing. This can feel hard. These kids sometimes act as though they're doing anything to avoid relationship, anything possible to make us not want to be in relationship with them. I totally 100% get that. And that doesn't change the truth that toxic stress changes the brain, relational healing changes our brain. Remember that at our core, we are relationally interdependent being. We are designed to be in connection, and we can harness the power of the connection being a biological imperative and our desire to be relationally interconnected to one another. We can harness that to prompt and build and cultivate resilience in our nervous system. About 20, maybe 5 years ago at this point, it's been, it was back in the 90s, scientists made this really cool discovery of mirror neurons. And mirror neurons are neurons in our brain that fire based on the neurons in somebody else's brain firing. So let me tell you how they were discovered, because that might help make it a little bit more clear. But there were these scientists working in a lab. I have no idea what they were actually trying to study, but they had monkeys hooked up to electrodes, and they were monitoring like the monkeys' brain activity. And my understanding of the story is that the scientists went on break. And so the monkeys were still hooked up and their brain activity was still being monitored, but they weren't actively engaged in their research. The scientists were taking a break and they were eating a snack. And one of the scientists noticed while they were eating a snack that the monkeys' brains, the monkeys who were watching them, the scientists, eat the snack, the monkeys were not eating the snack, the scientists were, okay, that the monkeys' brains were firing in the same pattern as the researchers. The monkeys' brains were firing. Their neural firing pattern was happening as if the monkeys were eating, but the monkeys weren't eating. They were watching the scientists eat. Okay, so my brain fires mirroring the firing of the brain of the person that I'm with. And we can really lean into this power of the mirror neuron system when we think about providing relational healing for our kids. Because ultimately, although there's a lot of like tips and techniques and parenting strategies and interventions that I could teach you about, and they're all helpful, without a doubt, they're helpful. Ultimately, what is most helpful, what changes the brain, is our brain staying regulated, our brain offering relational experiences and connection, because the child's brain will have a neural pattern experience based on the caregiver's experience of regulation or offering the co-regulation. Our brains are shaped by being in connection with each other. Like literally, our brains change because of each other and because of being in relationship with one another. Laura Nost has written some really good books for parents. She has a pretty fantastic social media presence. She's been really ill, so she posts much less frequently. But when she wasn't ill, she is such, what's the word? I mean, she's such an advocate for kids. And has this amazing quote that you may have even seen floating around, especially if you use social media. When little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not join their chaos. So that brings us back to the original kind of regulation, co-regulation cycle, parasympathetic, sympathetic. Babies cry and they get really upset. Caregivers have to come in and share their calm, right? We're going to use the power of that system to bring about relational healing to our kids' brains that didn't have that regulation cycle set the way we would hope it would be in their earliest years because of toxic stress and trauma and loss, right? All these negative experiences that impacted their regulation, right? Our job now is to kind of jumpstart that system or redo that system, prompt the development of that system. And we do that by offering our co-regulation, not joining their chaos. Now, I totally understand that this is a very, very hard task. That this is hard for average parents parenting, developmentally on target, neurotypical kids, right? Those of us parenting kids who are more chronically dysregulated have had relational experiences of toxic stress or trauma and loss. It is so hard to share our calm and not join their chaos. But ultimately, that really truly is what we have to do as much as we can, not all the time. If you've never heard me speak before, one of the things I'm really known for is we are not needing to be perfect parents. Okay, I have no expectation that every time your child is really dysregulated that you share your calm and don't join their chaos. That's not possible. That's not possible in my house, right? But we want to aim to do that as much as possible. So one of the things we've got to do is think about, how do I maintain enough of my own calm that I could consider sharing it with them? So a really, really important thing to do, and a really hard thing to do when you're parenting a kid with significant behavioral challenges. And now we're in, a pandemic. I'm recording this webinar for you as we're moving back into back to school season in the middle of this 2020 pandemic, where we're all still quite isolated and we're all spending a significant amount of time with our kids, more than usual for a lot of us. It is more important than ever that we as caregivers cultivate relationships that allow us to feel seen, felt, and known. We have to find our people. We have to find people who either get our experience because they understand it, they share it. They're also parents of kids who have some behavioral challenges. Or we get lucky enough to find people who, even though they don't truly get it, they believe us. And they're willing to hear what we have to say and support us and not judge us and not offer us parenting suggestions that, first of all, we've already thought of, second of all, don't even work for these kids, or they criticize our parenting, or they say, well, if that was my kid, that would never be allowed to happen, or all those kinds of things. When we're parenting kids with behavioral challenges, histories of complex trauma, toxic stress, we've got to find a way to cultivate relationships that allow us to feel seen, felt, and known. We need those people in real life, or we need to find them on the internet. We need to have FaceTimes with them. We need to Zoom with them. We need to text with them. We need to have chat threads with them. We need to find them in Facebook groups. Inside these groups, we want to, or in these relationships, doesn't have to be a group, we've got to create the safety to authentically express all of our emotions without any kind of fear of being judged or any sort of repercussion happening from sharing our true authentic selves. Okay, so when we as caregivers are experiencing a lot of emotional stress and duress, and we can't really give that emotional stress back to our kids, we've got to find other places to give it. We've got to find other people who can hold our authentic expression of emotions, whether that be anger, sadness, intense grief, overwhelm, helplessness, hopelessness. We need people that will welcome those feelings, hold all those feelings, but also not just like jump in and join us in those feelings, and then we churn and churn and churn and churn and churn and churn and churn, and we never have any relief from the helplessness or hopelessness. True, authentic relational experiences don't prompt us to get stuck in those negative emotions, but they provide a space for those negative emotions to be expressed and shared without any fear, without any judgment. And so eventually we can move through those negative emotions and find our own rest again. So again, we can offer our calm instead of joining our chaos. All I do is talk about relational connections. It's the most important thing for our kids, but it's the most important things for us too. And I know that it's hard. I know it's hard to prioritize. I know it's hard to find those people. I want to really encourage you to look for and find and nourish and cultivate those relationships. When we are feeling more capable of providing our calm instead of joining our chaos, then there's a couple really key things I want you to think about with your kids that are going to help build and increase resilience. And one of the most important ones is being with our kids in a way of playfulness, in a state of playfulness. So playfulness is, when I'm talking about playfulness in this training, playfulness is a state of the nervous system. It's not something we do. So we don't play a game, although certainly we can play a game and playfulness can emerge. But playfulness is a way of being. It's a sensation in our nervous system. It has some of that sympathetic energy, right? There's a little bit of accelerator there, but we're available for connection. We're offering connection. We're having fun, right? There's this playful, easy way of being. But again, when I talk about playfulness for the next few minutes, be really reminding yourselves, I'm not talking about something to do. I'm talking about a way of being. The cool thing about playfulness is that it emerges when connection is available. Like, so when I'm with somebody and connection is present, playfulness can emerge from that. But playfulness can also be used the other way, like to get into a place of connection. Look for ways to make the mundane playful. Okay, so easy one to think about is doing chores, but doing homework, doing things that traditionally we often think are supposed to be serious, or when we interject playfulness into it, it feels like we're not taking it seriously or we're not doing our work, right? But actually, having and resting into a state of playfulness allows our nervous system to shift into experiencing safety. And when we're experiencing safety, when there's that felt safety on board, right, we can be more available for connection. We have the opportunity to be more regulated. And honestly, we're more likely to be able to use our thinking brain. So we're more likely to be able to make good choices. We're more likely to learn things. We're more likely to be able to accomplish our homework. So if you notice a tendency to kind of squash play and playfulness when we're really supposed to be getting work done, just notice and see if it's possible to allow some of that playfulness to remain or not get squashed. It actually probably is going to help the task get done or help the learning be achieved more long-term and more quickly. Really, 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 like really be on the lookout for how can I infuse playfulness into everyday life, especially now, right? Like for a lot of us, life has gotten really, really mundane. Sometimes it's hard to even remember if we did something today or if we did it yesterday or 2 days ago because life has gotten so mundane that we're losing some of these markers about life. And so we're missing novelty and we're missing playfulness and we're missing delight as we're experiencing this pandemic. So be deliberate about looking for ways to make the mundane playful. Playfulness says to kids, I'm safe. So if I'm working to have a state of playfulness in my own nervous system, I am communicating to that child, I'm safe. And that is contributing to the possibility that they be able to experience felt safety. And then, of course, if their nervous system can move into a state of playfulness, they're then going to experience their own bodies and their own brains and their own minds as being safe. Because kids are actually looking into the environment and they're looking to us to determine if they're safe, but they're also looking into their own internal experience. So if they can have an internal experience of playfulness, that's another place that they are going to be able to receive a sense of safety from. Playfulness widens the window of stress tolerance. So playfulness literally opens up that window of tolerance, and so that we can tolerate more stress before, quote unquote, freaking out. So this is true for our kids, but y'all, this is true for us too, right? That parenting kids with behavior challenges and with histories of toxic stress and trauma and loss is hard. It's really stressful and challenging to parent these kids. So if we can engage in playfulness, we are going to widen our window of tolerance too, and we're going to be able to tolerate the challenges of parenting them a lot better. Playfulness improves immune function, which is pretty cool. And also, here we are, middle of a pandemic, something that's also really helpful. But truly, there's research that shows that because playfulness decreases stress and increases resilience, that improves immune functioning. Okay, so again, take this to heart for yourself as well as for your children. This is another benefit. Yeah, I've had a group of parents recently be talking about playfulness, and almost every single one of them is saying playfulness is so hard for me. And I get it. Playfulness has been really hard for me in my life too. It's something I've had to really work on, be really deliberate about, really kind of grow my own muscle of playfulness. So I'm kind of giving you these benefits of playfulness to try to convince you to go ahead and start building that playfulness muscle. Widens your window of tolerance, improves immune functioning. These all seem like pretty big wins, don't they? Playfulness improves learning and memory. Another huge win. So there's a lot of research that shows that the neurochemistry of play, delight, novelty is the neurochemistry that improves recall. So we learn things better and we're more likely to recall them if these learning experiences happen in times of playfulness. So I know that kids that are not terribly regulated can go from playful to totally out of control really quickly. And sometimes we're driven to kind of keep a lid on some of that playfulness because we're afraid of how quickly that could move into totally out of control. And I totally get that. And I'm going to encourage you to look and see if there's spaces where maybe you can let some of that playfulness go just a little bit longer, or risk once or twice a day, that playfulness sort of merging into out of controlness, and just kind of, experimenting with, can we have more experiences of playfulness and still keep some sort of semblance of order in our home? Because play and playfulness is so beneficial to the brain, and it really grows stress resilience. There's a lot of other benefits to play. One of the things that we get when we're playful with somebody is a sense of, I'm a pretty cool person, I'm really fun to be with. And these kids, they need that as much as possible too. Okay, so play and playfulness, get their bodies moving, move these kids, okay? And this even more now, especially as, as kids are in school, and if your kids are doing virtual school, or we're transitioning back to in-person school, but there's less up and out of their desks, there's less recess, there's less actual interaction with other kids, we still have to figure out ways to keep kids' bodies moving. All kids' bodies need movement and kinesthetic activity, but kids with histories of toxic stress, trauma, and loss, kids who have overactive danger brains, they especially need to have continual opportunities for movement. So kids really need to be moving at least every 15 minutes, even if it's just small movement, shifting around in their chairs, standing up and sitting back down, fidgeting, chewing gum, having a snack. These are kind of little ways of movement. And then kids really need gross motor movement, like big body movement, even if it's just walking, at least every 2 hours. So this also means that I'm a real big stickler for the fact that kids should never, ever, 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 ever lose recess. That kids who are struggling with behaviors need more recess. They need more movement, not less. And substituting recess for walking laps isn't acceptable either. We need kids moving. We need gross motor movement. We need movement that is full of surprise and delight, and it's not overly controlled or regulated like walking, but it also needs to have social elements in it if possible. Okay, so kids, I really believe this in my course, should never, ever, 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 ever lose recess. Kids who are struggling behaviorally need more movement, not less, right? Like if we gave kids more recess, we would probably see a decrease in behaviors and an increase in learning. And there are some studies that are showing that this is true. I know that we're stuck inside a little bit more than usual, and then we're also going to be entering into winter months again. So here's some ideas for how we can keep our kids' bodies moving, even if we can't get outside too much. Some of these are going to test your own window of tolerance. Like you might look at some of the things on this list and be like, oh my gosh, no, those things are not happening in my house. And that's cool. Like only bring activities into your home that you can experience and support yourself and stay inside your own window of tolerance. But I also encourage you to just reflect on if there's any of these activities where you're like, no way. And ask yourself, does that really need to be a no? Is that activity really a hard no? Or are there ways I could set up parameters to make this activity safe and fun and playful for everyone and get these kids in the movement that they need? Because truly, the more playful and the more movement you give them, actually the more regulated that they're going to be and the less out of control they're going to be. So pillow fights, building forts, jumping on the bed or on the furniture. I have a friend who took their guest bedroom and just made it into a big kind of gross motor sensory room for their kids, including the bed where their guests would normally stay. When the pandemic hit and we were all really forced inside for long periods of time. And so she really decided to kind of reevaluate her own values. Like, is it okay for my kids to jump on the furniture? Are there parameters I can set up that could make this okay so that my kids can get what they need and their brains can be more regulated? Indoor obstacle courses, setting up chairs to crawl over or crawl under the table. Again, like build like a little fort out of blankets and crawl under there. Setting up, pieces of paper that could be like hop, 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 hopped to a skipping stone. Look for different creative ways that you could create a safe indoor obstacle course. Sensory play, water beads, rice, beans, shaving cream, putting kids, even big kids, in the bathtub or outside to play with finger paint, shaving cream, bathtub paints. Really getting kids involved in messy sensory play. Mud, dirt, digging in the dirt, things like that. Baking and cooking, and doing it with their hands, so they're kneading bread or they're stirring dough or mixing cookie dough. Allowing messy sensory play with lots of good hand washing and cleaning up, and again, is playfulness will help all of that go more smoothly. If we're going to play video games, I think it's awesome to see if there's a way we can do video games that encourage movement. The Wii, the Xbox Kinect, these new like virtual reality kind of games where kids are up and moving and swinging and dancing, those kinds of games can often be a good compromise from screen time to still keeping the body moving. slapjack card game, or look for other kind of card games, especially if you have a kid who's more sedentary and a hard time like moving. What are some ways you could get movement in without kind of stressing their system too much if they're a kid that doesn't move very much? Playing hide and seek in the house, putting the music on and having dance parties. All of these can be really good, fun ways to get some movement in. You can try to interject movement in times of some mild behavioral stress. If you've got like a major outburst or tantrum going on, that might not be the best time to try to get some playfulness or some movement in. But if you've got some minor or mild dysregulation, some back talk, some sassiness, some opposition, maybe even some defiance, experiment with kind of dropping whatever the problem is in the moment and offering up an opportunity for play or movement. It's going to feel like a reward. It's going to feel like, why would I invite my kid into some playful, fun, movement-based activity when they're being rude or sassy or smart-mouthed or refusing to do their chores? Well, the reason is because playfulness and movement help bring the brain and the body back into connection and regulation, and then pro-social cooperative behaviors can emerge. So you can try these things inside moments of behavioral challenges, but especially for building resilience, I want you to look for opportunities when things are going a little bit more smoothly to offer up more play or offer up more movement, so that we can really be deliberate about building that resilience, widening that window of tolerance outside times of behavioral stress. Tons and tons of research is very clear. Movement regulates the brain. It widens our window of tolerance. Movement teaches us about who we are. And it sounds a little bit strange to think about, but some of our kids' behavioral challenges is about their lack of connection to themselves and to their bodies and knowing their bodies. This is somewhat because awareness of our bodies and coming to know who we are through our bodies is a part of those early attachment experiences. And toxic stress and trauma and loss, prevent some of our kids from having as many of those body-based experiences that help them come into contact with who they are. And so moving our kids' bodies helps them experience their body and ultimately come into more connection with themselves, learn about who they are. This is building resilience. This is widening that window of tolerance. They will have more stress tolerance and stress resilience the more they know who they are, and movement is an awesome way to do that. It's really, really clear that movement improves academic outcomes when kids are not just sitting learning for hours and 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 hours, but if their bodies are moving. And this is true about adult learners too. That when I teach adults, when I teach therapists, when I teach parents, I do my in-person teaching in a way that gets their bodies moving, because movement improves learning just like playfulness does. Playfulness, movement, offering up connection, all of these experiences help us to create the mirror for who we are. So not only does movement help us learn about what our body is and where our body is in space, what our body's capable of, movement, playfulness, and connection gives us a mirror of who we are. We learn about who we are through the eyes of the other. This brings us back to the early attachment experiences again. Babies learn, I am so precious. I am so wonderful. I bring this person joy. I am capable, because of how they're looked at by adoring adults. right? By adults who can see into their inherent preciousness and infinite worth. Kids learn they're inherently precious and have full of infinite worth because of the eyes that have looked at them. And trauma and toxic stress often offers to our kids a broken mirror. That what these kids saw in their earliest months and years of life was looks of anger, looks of terror, looks of nothingness, right? And unintentionally, then, our children learn that this is something to do with who they are. This is actually a protective mechanism in our brain and of the attachment cycle, that we internalize those experiences as there's something wrong with me. I'm scary. I'm worthless. I'm terrible. I'm terrifying. It's not true. It's a broken mirror. Our kids are, infinitely precious and full of wonderment simply because they exist. But because of the mirror that they were given, they learned something different about themselves. And when we can be with kids, especially kids who are struggling, especially kids who are not behaving well, especially kids who are not very regulated, with a boundary. So we definitely have to boundary bad behavior and help kids learn new socially appropriate ways of being in the world and getting their needs met. For sure. This isn't about excusing bad behavior. This is about offering the boundaries while still offering connection, offering co-regulation, offering eyes of, even though this behavior is not acceptable, you are full of infinite worth and inherently precious just because you exist. This helps gives our kids, who are met in the world so often with looks of irritation, anger, disgust, frustration, right? Those are the eyes these kids are usually getting. And we have the power to give them a new mirror. Because if we believe we're inherently precious and overflowing with worth, we behave in ways that reflect those beliefs, right? Because regulated, connected kids who feel safe and know what to do behave well. So hands down, that is the number one thing I want you to walk away from this hour and a half with. Regulated, connected kids who feel safe and know what to do behave well, right? And we also learned that behavior is simply an externalization of inner experience based on their brain development and what's happening in their brain, and that connection is a biological imperative. And those of you who are parenting kids who seem as though they don't want anything to do with connection, that's my offering for you especially. Connection's a biological imperative. Your child might be acting like they don't need or want connection, but I promise you that they do. I promise you that's also true about yourself, right? And so go out, find connections, fill your own cup so that you can keep offering these kids experiences of connection. And you can keep inviting them into playfulness, that you can prioritize moving their body. And that in all of these experiences, ultimately what we're doing is giving these kids a new mirror. I hope this was helpful for you. Again, this is where you can find me, robingoebel.com. I blog pretty regularly at robingoebel.com/blog. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram. If you go to robingoebel.com, there is a free 3-part video series on understanding how trauma impacts memory processing specifically. So we're going to talk about that in this webinar. But understanding how trauma impacts memory processing is another really key piece to understanding our kids' behaviors and knowing how to help them. And so there's like a free, I think the 3 parts total up to about 30 minutes of additional education and support, again, as well as all the blogs and all the articles that I've written. If you're curious more about regulated, connected kids who feel safe, behave well, I have articles on that. I have blog articles written about the concept that all behaviors are adaptive. Even when behaviors look maladaptive, they actually are adaptive based on how our brain is experiencing every unfolding moment. So if this neurobiology and really putting on those x-ray vision goggles to see how behavior is just an externalization of inner experience, if this has piqued your interest, I have so many more places for you to expand your knowledge even more. So I hope you find me over on my website, on my blog, or on social media. If you do find me those places, say hello. Let me know, where you learned about me from this event. And you can hop on my email list and we can stay in contact with each other that way too. I've been really delighted and blessed to be asked to continue to offer these educational opportunities for you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you for everything that you're doing to care for these kids. It really matters. Thank you.